Coming up, wildfires burn through one of the planet's most biodiverse countries. El Niño turns a typical Colombian dry season into an environmental nightmare.
Es un fenómeno del niño agravado porque al niño se le agrega el calentamiento global.
And a new study looks into what could go wrong if more global renewable energy is produced.
How do we discard of all these things when they die?
As any infrastructure and technology, there are impacts.
But first, a restaurant in Florida comes under fire for its so-called climate-friendly food.
I'm curious about your response to this Hopdoddy burger bar that is advertising a beef burger that will, quote, save the planet one bite at a time.
Right.
Just 2 Degrees starts right now.
She's awake. She gonna baby, baby. Yeah.
Farmers in Europe are livid about unfair competition. They're afraid that agricultural machinery subsidies may be taken away. At marches in late January, they expressed concerns for policies decreasing the amount of meat they can produce, and unpredictable weather has only added to their woes.
Farming techniques have changed dramatically over the past 4 decades. Genetic engineering, synthetic fertilizer, and pesticides have helped to feed more people worldwide. But the hyperproductivity hasn't been attainable for everyone, particularly poor farmers. In 2023, 27% of people worldwide were working in agriculture, compared to 44% in 1991. But as governments brought in more policies favoring large landowners and producers, and as economies grew, more people migrated to urban areas, leaving fewer to tend the land. Today, the world faces a looming food crisis, with more than 800 million people experiencing chronic hunger worldwide, about 10% of the global population. Experts say it's proof of an inefficient agricultural system. Researchers at the Bayer Group interviewed 800 farmers in 8 countries, including the US, China, Brazil, and Kenya. 568 of them spoke of unpredictable weather on their farms, including soaring temperatures leading to declining yields. There are also rising fertilizer and energy costs, which means fluctuations in earnings and profits. Farmers argue their governments have done little to help, with policies and private investment practices often favoring larger corporations. The regulations have forced farmers to buy more expensive seed varieties, which keeps them in debt. Rising labor costs and declining rural populations also hamper the ability to scale up their operations. But a movement is growing to use agroecology and regenerative agriculture to address farmers' concerns, with hopes to transform the agricultural sector to rely on less water, synthetic fertilizers, and pesticides. According to the World Economic Forum, over 90% of farmers said they're willing to transition to regenerative agriculture, saying it could help improve drought resilience and food security. But the World Farmers Organization argues new technologies must be attainable and ensure small farmers can earn enough to make a profit, and that any new changes must include better access to loans and investments.
Meanwhile, a burger joint in Florida is being criticized for claims they're making about an item on the menu being climate-friendly. Hopdoddy Burger Bar sells a hamburger which it says can, quote, save the planet one bite at a time. It's part of an increasing trend by meat and dairy companies looking to rebrand products as environmental solutions. Hopdoddy says it neutralizes the emissions generated by cows by changing the animals' diets.
I'm curious about your response to this Hopdoddy burger bar that is advertising a beef burger that will, quote, save the planet one bite at a time.
If you look at the actual reports made by climate scientists who are not vegan, you'll notice that the worst offenders, the highest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions are actually free-range animals. So these charts weren't made by vegans, because if it was up to us, we'd be focused on freeing the factory farmed animals first. And I was actually fascinated to learn the reasons why free-range animal products are actually worse for the climate than factory farm ones. It seems counterintuitive, doesn't it?
You and I have talked about this before. It's unlikely everyone on the planet will convert to veganism. So Hopdoddy Burger Bar says it's buying meat from ranchers who use eco-friendly agricultural techniques. Do you think this could eventually be an alternative?
Actually, no, it can't. I'm actually 100,000% confident that it can't be an alternative because we're already at a stage of climate breakdown. We're already seeing the Earth's natural life support systems fall apart. So even though obviously animals raised outdoors are not treated as badly as animals who are in factory farms, if the world were to switch to free-range animal products, the carbon emissions from animal consumption would actually go up. And we're in a situation where we need to do everything to drastically reduce carbon emissions as quickly as possible. So there's actually no chance, and I don't want to be a doomsayer, but this is just an objective fact. There is no hope for humanity if we don't switch away from animal consumption ASAP.
And Gabriel, what about initiatives from people like Bill Gates giving a cow's seaweed to reduce the methane in their burps, and initiatives to change how manure is handled and those that help soil capture carbon? Do these at all ease your mind that beef could one day be okay to consume?
I think the only sustainable form of animal products that might ever come out is so-called cultured meat. So that would be animal meat that is created without the animal. Exactly. Right. Of course, there's still concerns about that. How are animals exploited at all? They might not need to be exploited at all because DNA, you could just take a painless tiny amount of DNA and then grow a huge amount of beef from that. So that would absolutely be sustainable. Health matters are different, but health is a personal choice. That might actually have a smaller footprint than even plant farming. So I think anyone concerned with carbon emissions from animal consumption should be focused on that, should be focused on coming out with 1,000 different plant-based burgers as well. Because, right now we only really have Beyond Meat, we have Impossible Burgers, but we're just at the beginning stages. I think if Bill Gates wants to put money into doing something effective, that's where his focus should be.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture says it has no authority to verify a company's claims that it sells climate-friendly burgers. And yet, the organization still approves those companies' claims. Are beef companies winning the narrative war?
That is a very good question. I will admit they're doing a huge amount of damage to the truth. They're doing a huge amount of damage to the planet and doing a huge amount of damage to animals with their misinformation campaigns. There's that famous saying, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. So we're in that stage now where they're fighting us. And some people may laugh at the idea of vegans, animal rights advocates ever winning this battle. But again, it's a simple fact of the future is either going to be plant-based and, renewably powered in terms of electricity, or there won't be a future. The planet's atmosphere is an inanimate object. It doesn't care what you or I think. The Earth is simply just overheating, and it's getting to a point where, most people think climate change is a threat in terms of floods and fires and stuff because that's dramatic. But we're talking about food right now. The real threat to the human race from climate change is crop failure. It's us running out of food, and we can see how much violence and how much war there is in the world right now. Imagine if there was global shortages of water. There's global crop failure is increasing. So imagine if that gets worse and worse. What's going to happen in terms of human conflict? That's the number one threat we need to be focused on as a species, and the number one thing any individual can do about it. You don't need to wait for a politician to take action. The number one thing an individual can do about it is require drastically, 20 times less land to feed you by eating plant-based meat.
Meanwhile, it's not easy standing up to powerful meat, dairy, and energy companies. Poor nations know this well. Corporations use an obscure area of international law known as investor-state dispute settlements. And ISDS allows companies to sue countries if they believe their investment treaties have been breached. Critics say the system prioritizes foreign interests over local environments and people. Between 2011 and 2021, fossil fuel and mining industries have won over $100 billion in cases that target actions to protect the environment.
Multi-billion-dollar lawsuits launched by fossil fuel companies through shadowy investment tribunals are obstructing action on climate change, with countries in the global south increasingly targeted. The area of international law known as Investor-State Dispute Settlements, or ISDS, allows corporations to protect their assets if a country revokes oil licenses or enacts more stringent environmental regulations. Under the fair and equal treatment provisions, These panels can rule against environmental laws enacted by national parliaments if they conflict with a corporation's profit expectations. Foreign investors exclusively have the right to initiate claims, and claims include not just actual losses, but future ones too. The idea first gained currency in the early 1990s during the height of globalization, as a way to attract foreign investment in the global south while protecting investors from weak legal systems in those countries. A report titled Paying Polluters, presented before the UN General Assembly last year, cites the number of claims and the size of payouts are soaring. Examples include 2 Australian mining companies pursuing nearly $37 billion from the Democratic Republic of Congo, twice its 2022 GDP. In Ecuador, after the government placed taxes on foreign oil operations, French and US companies were awarded $800 million, 15% of the country's entire public spending budget. The UN climate talks in Dubai last year concluded with language on transitioning away from fossil fuels. But governments are coming under heightened pressure to boost regulation and reject further oil, gas, and coal projects because it could leave them vulnerable to litigation under the ISDS process. Critics say companies are exploiting the vaguely worded provisions to challenge policies taken by governments in the public interest. They argue the ISDS system gives corporations a parallel justice system that forces governments to capitulate. A case in point is Pakistan, which agreed to a settlement with a foreign firm which waived penalties to the tune of $11 billion in exchange for reopening a copper mine. According to the UN, the majority of cases in 2022 were brought by investors in richer nations, and 65% of the cases were lodged against countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Experts estimate that global efforts to combat climate change could result in $350 billion in claims. For developing nations, the results of such disputes can be devastating. Actions taken in the public interest, including raising environmental, health, or labor standards, can lead to billions of dollars in claims that they simply can't pay.
Colombia has literally been under fire. More than 200 fires have burned through forested areas in the departments of Cundinamarca, which is an area that includes the capital Bogotá, and in Santander to the north. The government has declared an emergency in both regions and freed up funds to help deal with the crisis. And there is a risk of more fires to come. El Niño is expected to turn up the heat and bring droughts. The climate authorities have placed more than half the country on red alert.
Ya hay unas partes que han sido afectadas por el fuego y hay una vegetación que aún no ha sido consumida. Lo que estamos haciendo es como tratar de dividir la parte que está ya consumida por el fuego de la que no está dividida para cortar esa cadena de fuego y que no se siga propagando.
Hoy, con unidades del Ejército Nacional, nos encontramos atendiendo un incendio de cobertura vegetal que ya lleva aproximadamente 3 días de activación. En compañía de organismos de socorro como lo es Defensa Civil, Bomberos de la Ciudad de Bogotá y Fuerza Aérea de Colombia, estamos atendiendo esta emergencia que ha presentado exactamente 10 hectáreas en su totalidad y obviamente hay focos calientes que se encuentran todavía activos. Se están controlando, pero en horas de la noche por la alta altura y los vientos se vuelven a activar, generando así pues nuevos incendios.
And as the fires burned around a drier, hotter Bogotá, animals were spotted sheltering from the blazes in built-up areas, and residents noticed a big change in air quality.
Se siente, pues, por lo menos en la parte del centro donde he tenido que transitar, he sentido el aire un poco más pesado que la parte donde está la montaña, donde están los incendios últimamente en estos días.
Por la quema de los cerros. Entonces, todo el humo de los cerros se viene hacia la parte de este lado y lo está afectando a uno mucho.
The global renewable energy network, REN21, has released a new report delving into the potential negative impacts of scaling up renewable energy. The findings make clear comparisons between the harm caused by fossil fuel production versus wind and solar energy.
Over the last few years, we've been hearing more about solar farms taking up lots of land, wind turbines killing birds, some of them endangered, and questions about how we safely discard these technologies when they no longer work. Do you think these concerns are justified?
These concerns are existing and they need to be taken seriously, but they're not justified. Renewable has just published the Renewable Energy and Sustainability Report that has really been produced in a very broad crowdsourced approach and a multi-stakeholder approach that was involving governments, industry, but also environmental and human rights organizations and contributors. And what we clearly see is building on the evidence that is existing, renewable energy today is really the most sustainable energy source existing. There is indeed a lot of misinformation and myth out there, but this report is really a very good start to address basically these existing concerns.
But you just mentioned something interesting about there being a lot of misinformation. Where do you think it comes from, and why are the people doing it?
Where does it come from? I think, first of all, change is something that is always a bit varying, and if it's being used, there is a lot of interest of players to keep the existing world, but we know that this existing world, the fossil fuel-based world, is responsible for climate change, for pollution, for impacts on biodiversity, but also on the well-being of human beings. So there is a need to change. And I think here we really see that there is a lot of positivity that can be communicated. So as an example, we have for the moment in Europe a lot of mobilization of the agricultural space. When we're looking into photovoltaics and wind, for instance, there is a massive opportunity with agrivoltaics or also wind and cohabitation of agricultural practice, forestry practice, fishery even, with renewable energy to not only reduce basically potential environmental impacts of infrastructure, but also generate income for those players who clearly are facing a challenging economic situation. And I think these communication streams need to be pushed out in a much more educational way, probably, but also in a broader way. So it is about the inspiring stories. So for instance, when you're looking, there are really interesting examples in the report, looking in some African countries where we see that installing photovoltaics basically on agricultural land is actually improving not only the biodiversity, but also the yield of agriculture practice, because there's less evaporation. And in countries that are really facing basically the impact of heat on agricultural yield, this is something that is fundamental. So there are benefits on the environmental side, but also economic benefits. And these stories, I think, are not known enough. So media like you have a key role to play here.
You and I were both at COP28, where countries talked about improving or increasing the amount of renewable energy production there is over the next 5 to 10 years. Do you think the renewable energy resources, wind turbines, solar panels, these are all accessible to everyone?
I think this is in principle, yes, and the but comes from they are accessible everywhere because renewable energy does exist everywhere. And this is basically also the benefit. You can really adapt it also to the local conditions. It can generate local benefits, economic benefits, but also environmental benefits, reduce pollution, increase biodiversity, or address biodiversity losses. What is clearly the case and is the fact that the technology today is being produced in some countries. You see, there is clearly, when we're looking at solar PV, a concentration in China. And there is very clearly a ramp up that is necessary. And this was a very strong message from COP28 also, that it was ramping up the infrastructure, but also building up the supply chains. And building up the supply chains really in regional approaches also, because this transition to renewable energy needs to happen everywhere in the world.
Just to go back to my first question, Rana, are you not concerned that as we ramp up the production and use of renewables, solar, wind, are you concerned about how we discard the waste when they are no longer needed? These things take up a lot of space. They are, I'm guessing, quite intensive to manufacture.
how do we discard of all these things when they die?
And I think this is basically another finding of the report too, because obviously, as any infrastructure and technology, there are impacts. And that's also a case for renewable energy technologies. And the difference here is when you compare it to fossil fuel, and it's always important to compare what happens to renewables to fossil fuel. When we look at fossil fuel extraction, for instance, of materials, here you're extracting billions of tons. When we look at the oil, gas, and coal, that is being extracted to be burned. Whereas in the renewable energy supply chain and infrastructure, it is for producing technology, infrastructure, electric grids, electric mobility, etc. Here we're speaking about technology that can be recycled. See, and I think this is basically also one of the findings. There's already very good best practice out there. The industry is working on recycling concepts. It is about design. It is about increasing, obviously, the energy efficiency. But it is also about when we're looking, for instance, in the mineral uses in the scenarios, we see that there is in all main scenarios of IEA, IRENA on the material ramp up, for instance, in critical minerals, solar PV is the lowest share. When we're looking into the electric networks, storage and electric mobility, this is the largest share. It's really the bulk of material uses. Obviously, these are essential, but I take the example of electric mobility. Introducing sustainable transfers concepts, for instance, like walking, cycling, recycling, recycling standards and design standards that are evolving are really fundamental to basically reduce the impacts. And it's very clear that governments have a key role to play here to put in place the regulation and the regulatory framework and really adopt a sustainable or a systemic approach to the energy transition.
A major scientific breakthrough could save the critically endangered northern white rhinos from extinction. Researchers in Berlin say they've successfully conducted the first ever embryonic transfer, which can be used to produce a new species of white rhino in Kenya. When the last male rhino died in 2018, it sparked widespread concern about the future of the white rhino. Presently, there are only 2 female white rhinos, Fatu and her mother, Najing. Scientists transplanted the embryo into Najing and confirmed the pregnancy. If all goes well, she'll give birth to a healthy baby boy. There are reportedly around 300,000 breeding pairs of emperor penguins across 61 colonies in Antarctica. It's a figure that's expected to drop to 400 by the end of the century. As climate change fuels habitat change, experts say the emperor, which is the world's largest penguin, could be on the verge of extinction.
Emperor penguins. Flightless, dependent on sea ice to breed. Last year, a study by the British Antarctic Survey revealed a grim fate for several breeding colonies. Over 9,000 chicks drowned when the ice beneath them disappeared. But recent discoveries by the same outfit are offering glimmers of hope.
We managed to find these 4 new breeding sites, which have always existed, but we've never spotted them before. The importance of this is twofold. It does increase the population slightly, but also it shows us the colonies where the colonies are, because there are a discrete number of colonies around Antarctica.
Discrete because it's rare for penguins to form new ones. As global warming drives sea ice decline, the displaced may move to join the recently revealed breeding sites.
And that stands them in good stead with climate change, really, because it means they aren't static. They won't just stay there, whatever. We think that the majority of them will try to find new ice, better ice, and more stable ice if the ice on which they're breeding becomes unsuitable.
As they move, knowing where they're going makes it easier to track the threatened species. Vital information on how they're doing as their habitat shrinks. But the newly discovered colonies don't add much to the population, and tracking is all that experts can do.
We're already seeing sea ice change quite dramatically around Antarctica over the last 5 or 6 years, which isn't good for emperor penguins. We can monitor it. We can't put the sea ice back. We can't build something for them. That's not the way that it works.
And that's our show, but before I leave you, volunteers in the US state of North Carolina brought Christmas trees to a beach in the town of Kitty Hawk. It sounds weird, I know, but it seems to be for a good reason. The town's in an area known as Outer Banks and is vulnerable to climate change and erosion. The group hope the trees will help reinforce the sand dunes when they get buried by sand in 3 to 6 months. They also say that using the trees here means they won't be sent to the local landfill.